Have you ever wondered, could the Quran be describing what's happening in Palestine right now? Could a set of verses revealed over 1400 years ago actually be pointing to the rise of a nation, the spread of injustice, and a promise of divine justice that is still unfolding today? Bismillah. Today we're going to explore a powerful passage from the Quran, one that many have read but few have truly reflected on. A passage from Surah Al-Isra, right after the miraculous journey of the Prophet from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque. This chapter doesn't just tell a story, it carries a prophecy. It speaks of a people who were given power, who spread corruption, who were brought down, and then rose again. And as we reflect on the current events in Palestine and around Masjid al-Aqsa, we begin to see something extraordinary. Maybe this isn't just about the past, maybe the Quran is talking about right now. Traditionally, scholars believe this story had already played out, that both rises and both downfalls were historical events. But what if only the first one has passed, and the second is happening as we speak? This isn't about politics, it's not just a history lesson, it's something much deeper. This is a spiritual reflection on divine patterns, a reminder that the Quran is alive, that its warnings are timeless, that its truth stands, no matter who tries to suppress it. Because the Quran doesn't just inform, it transforms. And sometimes when oppression spreads and the world looks away, the Quran starts to speak louder, as if reminding us, you were told this would happen. So today we open our hearts. We ask, what is this sacred chapter really telling us? What does it mean for the Ummah, for the oppressed, for the future of justice? This is the story of a chosen people, a sacred land, a divine test, and a prophecy that may be unfolding before our very eyes. Let's begin. Before we dive into the details of the prophecy, we must begin where the chapter begins, with the journey. A journey unlike any other in human history. A journey not by land, not by sea, but by divine command. A journey that connects two sacred sites, and by doing so, ties together two nations, two legacies, and two spiritual destinies. The chapter opens by mentioning the miraculous night journey of the Prophet, from the sacred mosque to the furthest mosque. This is not just a physical transfer, it's a spiritual proclamation. That land, the land of the furthest mosque, is not an ordinary place. It is holy, it is blessed, it is chosen. Not by nations, not by empires, but by the one who created the heavens and the earth. That furthest mosque, resting in the heart of Jerusalem, holds centuries of prophetic history. It was the direction of prayer before the sacred house. It was the land walked upon by prophets of old. It was where revelation descended long before the final messenger ever arrived. And when the prophet stood in that mosque, leading all the previous prophets in prayer, it was not just a moment, it was a message that this land still matters, that it still belongs to the Ummah of belief, that it still has a role to play in the story of truth and justice. But the verses don't stop there. Immediately after this mention of the journey, the chapter shifts tone. From the awe of the miracle, it moves to a warning. A narrative begins about a people, a history, a promise, and a downfall. This transition is not random, it is intentional. It is as if the Quran is saying, this land is sacred, but it is also contested. It has been blessed, but also tested. And those who inhabit it will either honor its sanctity or face consequences. What makes this even more significant is the fact that these verses aren't just telling us what happened, they seem to be hinting at what will happen. Because right after the miraculous journey, the story begins about a group of people who were given honor, power, and responsibility. They were given chance after chance, but each time they chose corruption over justice, arrogance over humility. And so the stage is set, a sacred land, a chosen people, a divine warning, and a cycle that repeats, rise, corruption, fall. But what if that cycle hasn't ended? What if we are witnessing the next chapter of this story right now? As the words of this chapter unfold, a pattern begins to emerge, one that echoes through history, but also feels like it's whispering into our present moment. And it all begins with what they did when they had power. The story now takes a sharp turn. It's no longer about the sanctity of the land, it's about the actions of those who were entrusted with it. The verses declare that the children of Israel were warned, not just spoken to, but clearly and decisively informed, in a divine record. The message was this: you will cause corruption in the land, twice. That's not an accusation, it's a decree, it's a prophecy, it's a statement from the one who knows what was, what is, and what will be. This isn't ordinary corruption, this is widespread disorder, the kind that shakes societies, the kind that spreads injustice, arrogance, and oppression. And what makes it more severe is that it comes from a people who were given knowledge, a people who were given prophets, a people who knew better. According to classical scholars, this prophecy refers to two historical events. The first is often identified as the period when the ancient kingdom of Israel, once united under noble prophets like David and Solomon, became divided and corrupt. Over time, it abandoned divine guidance and became unjust, indulgent, and oppressive, both within and beyond its borders. This moral and spiritual downfall led to a worldly consequence. A powerful empire rose against them, not just any empire, but one described in the verses as strong, disciplined, and unstoppable. They were not acting on their own, they were sent. They were tools of divine justice. They invaded the land. They did not stop at the borders. They went deep into homes, cities, and sacred spaces. They humiliated what was once mighty. They exposed what had been hidden behind walls of pride. And just like that, the first fall had come to pass. Classical interpretations usually point to the Assyrian conquest in 722 BCE, when the northern kingdom was destroyed. Others link it to the Babylonian invasion under Nebuchadnezzar in 597 BCE, when Jerusalem was taken, the temple destroyed, and the population exiled. But regardless of which empire it was, the lesson is clear. When truth is abandoned, when power is abused, when justice is replaced by arrogance, then no structure, no city, and no temple can protect a people from divine consequence. This is not just a story of one nation. It is a law of history. When a people are blessed and they betray the blessing, they fall. When they are warned and they mock the warning, they are tested. And when they cause corruption in a land that was meant to be holy, they are replaced. The first rise of the children of Israel was built on divine favor, but their first fall was brought by divine wrath, not out of vengeance, but out of justice. But here's where the story becomes even more powerful, because the fall wasn't the end. They were given another chance. After the first fall, most would expect the story to end, but the verses say otherwise. They speak of mercy, of restoration, of another opportunity. The children of Israel were not abandoned. They were given a second chance. Not just survival, but revival. They were brought back. Their strength returned. Their numbers increased. Their power re-established. They once again became a nation with influence, wealth, and global presence. This is one of the most striking parts of the narrative, because while the first downfall is described clearly and with finality, the second rise is presented with conditions. The verse declares, "We gave you another chance. We supported you with wealth and children. We made you greater in manpower." This isn't just about population. It's about infrastructure, economy, international alliances, and control. In today's language, it sounds like the description of a superpower. But here's the turning point. What did they do with this new chance? The Quran continues, "If you do good, it is for yourselves, but if you do evil, it will come back to you." The warning is crystal clear. This second rise is not permanent. It is conditional. It depends on justice, righteousness, and obedience to God. If corruption returns, then so will consequences. Now, for over 1,000 years, scholars believed both rises and both falls had already happened. They pointed to historical events, the destruction of the first temple, the exile to Babylon, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and finally, the Roman invasion in 70 CE. But here's where modern scholarship is beginning to shift, because something changed in the last century. A people who had been scattered for nearly 2,000 years suddenly returned. A land that had been under the control of empires for generations suddenly became a nation-state. And that nation rose with incredible speed, militarily, technologically, politically. A new interpretation began to emerge. What if the second rise is not something from the past, but something we're seeing today? After all, the Quran clearly states that only the first fall was a completed promise. It says it came to pass, but the second one, it is introduced with the word when, not it happened. That subtle difference has led many scholars to question the classical timeline, and suddenly, the verses feel alive again. Not just a record of what was, but a mirror of what is. Not just history, but prophecy. What we're seeing in the land today, the domination, the expansion, the displacement of people, the military power, the injustice, could very well be the second corruption that the Quran warned about. And if that is the case, then what comes next is not far behind. Now that we've seen the possibility that the second rise is happening in our time, we must pause and understand a critical word used in the verses: corruption. The Quran does not speak vaguely when it says, "You will cause corruption in the land." It's not just talking about political mismanagement or economic unfairness. It's referring to deep, widespread injustice, the kind of corruption that leaves the weak broken, the innocent displaced, and the land soaked with fear and oppression. But what does that actually look like? Corruption, as described in divine scripture, includes spreading injustice, spilling innocent blood, uprooting families, violating sacred spaces, and enforcing tyranny over the vulnerable. It's the opposite of mercy, the opposite of balance. It is when might becomes right, and truth is silenced under the boots of power. In the modern context, many scholars and observers look at what is happening in Palestine today and ask, does this match the warning? The answer feels chilling. For decades, we have seen generations of people displaced from their homes. We have seen children grow up in the shadow of walls and weapons. We have seen ancient cities divided, sacred sites violated, and entire populations labeled as strangers in their own land. Is this not the kind of corruption the verse was warning about? And yet, despite all this, we are told that this is the second chance, that this rise was allowed, that the test has returned, not only for the people in power,
but for the world that watches, because corruption on this scale is not just the fault of those who commit it, it is also the silence of those who allow it. The allies, the supporters, the indifferent. The Quran teaches us that when corruption becomes the system, it is not just a political crisis, it is a spiritual one. When children cry, and their cries are ignored, when the sacred is desecrated, and the world remains quiet, when injustice is called peace, and peace is labeled rebellion, this is a sign that truth has been buried under propaganda, and mercy has been drowned in pride. This is why the warning matters so deeply, because the Quran is not just pointing fingers, it's opening eyes. It's telling us that corruption is not a sign of strength, it is a countdown. It is a test that always ends with accountability, and if the second rise has come with corruption, then the second fall is only a matter of time. This is not about celebrating loss or predicting doom. It is about remembering that no matter how high falsehood climbs, truth will always return, and justice, though delayed, will never be denied. So what happens when corruption reaches its peak? The Quran tells us, the same divine law that brought down empires of the past, Pharaoh, the people of Lot, the empires of greed and arrogance, comes into motion again. The verses say, when the first time of corruption came, we sent against you servants of ours, strong in power, who entered the homes and humbled the proud. These were not ordinary invaders, they were a tool of divine justice. They didn't rise by coincidence, they were sent to rebalance what had been distorted, to remove the pride that had replaced gratitude, to crush the cruelty that had overpowered compassion. And then, after that downfall, they were given a chance again, a second rise, a new opportunity. They were strengthened once more with numbers, wealth and influence. But the message was clear: if you do good, it is for your own benefit. But if you return to your old ways, then so will we return to ours. This part of the verse is subtle, but powerful. It's like a warning whispered through time: we will return. In other words, just as the first response came when corruption grew, another response will come if the same corruption reappears. The difference this time is that it's not spelled out directly in the past tense. It says, when the second promise comes, not when it came. That's important, because it suggests it hasn't happened yet. It's still to come. And this is where the modern understanding draws strength. For centuries, scholars looked backward to identify the two corruptions, but today, the second rise of power, military might, and political dominance is undeniable. And so the question becomes, has the second fall not yet occurred? And if it hasn't, what will it look like? The Quran describes it in layers. The downfall will not just be political, it will be emotional. The proud faces will be changed, darkened with fear, anger, and shame. The sacred mosque will be entered again by those who had done so before, and everything that was built in arrogance will be brought low. This is not just about one group of people, it's about a universal pattern, a law that applies to every nation, every civilization, every power that uses might to oppress, rather than uplift. Because when you rise through injustice, you will fall through justice. When you conquer with cruelty, you will be conquered through truth. And when you mock the mercy of God, it is only a matter of time before you taste His power. The divine response is never rushed. It gives time, it gives space, it allows reflection and repentance. But when the signs are ignored, and the warnings dismissed, then what remains is the fall. And perhaps that moment is closer than we think.
Okay, so let's zoom in now. After that first downfall, after the corruption, the collapse, the humiliation, you'd think that would be the end of the story, right? But no, Allah gave them another chance. That in itself is incredible. It shows something powerful. Even when people fall, even when nations mess up, the door of mercy can still open. So what happened? The verse says, then we gave you back the power over them. In other words, you weren't just restored, you were victorious. You got the upper hand again. Your enemy that once defeated you, now you defeated them. But Allah didn't stop there. The verse continues, we supported you with wealth and with children. Not just money, not just sons and daughters. This means population, growth, stability, legacy, a foundation for the future. And not just that, we made you greater in manpower. That means you became a force, a nation that other nations recognize. Your numbers increased, your military got stronger, your presence undeniable. Now here's the thing, all of this second chance, this revival, this power, it wasn't random. It was a test, a divine opportunity to make things right, to return to justice, to live in gratitude and humility. But the next words are the key. Allah says, if you do good, it is for yourselves. But if you do evil, then it is against you. That's it right there. That's the condition. The second rise was not a blank check. It came with responsibility. You're powerful. Use that power wisely. You're back in the land. Treat it with dignity. You're strong. Protect. Don't oppress. But what did we start seeing? Instead of humility, arrogance. Instead of justice, displacement. Instead of honoring the sacred, violating it. Instead of living in peace, building walls, enforcing sieges, and calling that security. And slowly, over the years, the world began to watch. A people who were once scattered, now dominant, a state that was once an idea, now a superpower, funded, armed, and politically untouchable. And now comes the question, is this the second rise that the verse speaks of? Because if it is, and many scholars today believe it is, then the clock is ticking. Because this rise, like the first, comes with a deadline, a condition, a divine contract. If you uphold justice, you remain. If you betray it, you fall. And here's the part that gives us hope. Just like Allah gave them a second chance, He gives us all second chances, as individuals, as communities, even as an ummah. So the real question is, when the second downfall comes, will we be among those who stand for truth, or those who watched in silence? Because when Allah gives a nation power, it's not just a blessing, it's a test. And when the test is failed, the next chapter begins. All right, this is where things get intense. Let's go back to the wording of the verse. It says, when the second promise comes, not came, not has come. It says when, future tense. That's a big deal. Because earlier, the first corruption and downfall was described as already fulfilled. A done deal, no debate there. But the second one, it's still open, still pending. And that opens the door to something massive. We might be living in the middle of this prophecy right now. For over 1,000 years, scholars thought both rises and both falls were behind us. And back then, that made sense. There was no Jewish state, no united political power. The people were scattered. There was no sign that anything like this would ever happen again. But then came the 20th century. In 1948, a state was declared. In 1967, it expanded. Suddenly, a people that had been in exile for 2,000 years were now in full control of the land, of its borders, of its air, of its sacred sites, all backed by the most powerful allies in the world. And with that came what the verse warned about: arrogance, corruption, oppression. So the scholars started asking, wait, what if the second rise is what we're seeing now? What if the second promise hasn't happened yet? What if this whole story isn't over? Because if this second rise is what the Quran is talking about, then the next part, the second downfall, is coming, not in the past. And here's the detail that seals it. The verse says, when the second promise comes, we will send a group again. And not just any group, a group that will enter the masjid, just like the first time. Now stop, think about that. What group entered the sacred site the first time? Historically, it was Muslims, the companions of the Prophet, under the leadership of the righteous. They didn't conquer to oppress, they came to liberate. They didn't desecrate, they protected, they didn't evict. They opened the land to all faiths and preserved its holiness. And the Quran says that when the second promise comes, that same entry will happen again. That's the moment many modern scholars point to and say, this is the final chapter, a second corruption, a second response, a return to the sacred site. And this time, it's not just history, it's prophecy unfolding. But here's the thing, the Quran doesn't give us the date. It doesn't say who, when, or how. It only gives signs, patterns, warnings. So we're not here to declare the moment. We're here to recognize the reality. Because the second promise, it's not just about the fall of a power. It's about the rise of truth, the return of justice, the recentering of a sacred place that belongs to no army, no state, but to faith itself. And maybe, just maybe, we're standing at the edge of that promise. Okay, this is the part that gives a lot of people chills. The verse says, they will enter the masjid again, just like they did the first time. So here's the question we need to ask. Who are they? Who entered the sacred masjid the first time in glory, not in corruption? Who walked into that land, not with tanks and tyranny, but with justice and peace? Who did Allah honor to be the protectors of that land after centuries of chaos? History tells us it was the early Muslims, the companions, the righteous generation, led by one of the most humble and God-conscious leaders this world has ever known. They didn't need bloodshed to prove strength. They didn't need political manipulation to take control. They came with dignity, with fairness, and even the people of other faiths welcomed them because they knew what kind of leadership they brought. And now the verse is saying, that's going to happen again. They will enter the masjid again. That's not a maybe. That's not wishful thinking. That's a divine statement. But here's the deeper meaning that many people miss. Allah is telling us that the next phase of this story is not just about what they did, it's about what we will do. Because the next group to enter, just like the first, will have to be worthy. They'll have to be people of sincerity, people of prayer, people of justice, people who carry the light of faith, not the weapons of arrogance. And if that's the case, then the question isn't just when will they enter, it's are we becoming the kind of people who are ready to enter? Because Allah doesn't give sacred victories to corrupted hearts. He doesn't hand over Holy Land to those who don't honor the holiness of life, of worship, of justice. The companions who entered the masjid the first time didn't just win because they had an army. They won because they had hearts anchored in truth. They cried in prayer before they ever picked up a sword. They feared God more than they feared the world. And they treated every life with dignity, even the lives of those who opposed them. That's the example the verse is pointing to. That's the legacy we're being called to revive. So if we're seeing signs that the second rise has already happened, and we believe the second downfall is coming, then we have to ask, will we be the ones Allah uses to fulfill His promise? And if so, we have work to do. Because the next time the masjid is entered with honor, it won't be because of politics. It won't be because of protests. It'll be because a generation rose up that finally understood victory doesn't come from strategy, it comes from sincerity. Now take a moment and look at what's happening around us. What we're seeing in Palestine today is not just another political conflict. It's not just a news headline or a humanitarian crisis. It's something deeper, something spiritual, something that feels familiar. You watch the events unfold, the walls going up, the homes being demolished, the sacred sites violated, children walking to school under occupation, families evicted in the middle of the night, and you can't help but feel like this was written somewhere, like it was foretold. And then you go back to these verses, and it all starts to connect. The second rise, it's here. The power is visible. The military is unmatched in the region. The alliances are global. Billions in aid. Untouchable politics. A technological and intelligence empire sitting on top of a people whose only defense is courage, prayer, and the hope that the world might one day see what's happening. And what does the verse say about this second rise? That it will be followed by corruption, injustice, arrogance, and then eventually a fall. Not just a political shift, but a collapse of pride, a crumbling of false strength, a moment when the faces that once smiled with power will twist in shock, fear, and defeat. You see, the signs are there, but not everyone sees them. Some people still believe this is all about land, or politics, or resources. But for those who reflect with the Quran in their hands and sincerity in their hearts, it's something much more. It's a live prophecy, a moment in time that was written before time began. And now the question is no longer, is this happening? The question is, what are we doing while it happens? Because the Quran doesn't just tell us stories to inform us, it tells us so we can position ourselves. Are we on the side of justice, or are we ignoring injustice? Are we supporting the truth, or are we afraid of speaking it? Are we preparing to be the people who return to the sacred masjid with honor, or are we just watching from a distance, hoping someone else will do it? And let's be clear, this isn't about violence or hate. The companions didn't win with cruelty, they won with truth, with discipline, with faith, with unwavering moral clarity. And that's what this moment requires from us now. It requires clarity, not confusion, courage, not comfort. Because Palestine today is not just a land being tested, it's a mirror, a reflection of who we are, what we stand for, and how much we truly believe in what the Quran says. So is this coincidence? Or are we standing right in the middle of a divine warning? The answer is up to us. Now listen closely, because this part is crucial. After everything, after the rises and the falls, the Quran does something extraordinary. It doesn't just end with punishment, it brings it back to mercy. Yes, the verses speak of downfall. Yes, they describe humiliation. Yes, they talk about destruction. But then right after all of that, Allah says something beautiful. Maybe your Lord will have mercy on you. That line changes everything. It reminds us that even after power is abused, even after corruption spreads, even after the sacred is desecrated, mercy is still on the table. That's how divine justice works. It's not revenge. It's not wrath for the sake of wrath. It's discipline. It's correction. It's an opportunity to return. But then comes the condition again. And if you return to corruption, we will return to punishment. Simple, straightforward, no confusion. If mercy is received with gratitude, it continues. If it's met with arrogance, it ends. That's the balance. That's the justice. That's the warning. Now zoom out. This message wasn't just for one nation. It's for anyone given power, any people entrusted with responsibility, any soul blessed with influence. Because power is a test, wealth is a test, freedom is a test, even pain is a test. And the Quran is telling us, if you misuse what you're given, it won't last. It might take a year, it might take a generation, but it won't last. That's not pessimism, that's divine justice. Now let's flip the mirror toward ourselves, because it's easy to talk about others, easy to say look at their corruption, or see how they fall. But these verses, if we really understand them, also speak to us. Our ummah today is broken in many ways, divided, distracted, sometimes silent when we should speak, sometimes careless when we should care. We watch injustice and scroll past. We hear of suffering and say that's sad, but then do nothing, and yet we still have time, because just like they were given a second chance, we are being given one too. The doors of mercy are still open. The night is still ours to pray. The world is still ours to change. The downfall of oppressors might be written, but the rise of the righteous, that depends on us. Will we live by the Quran? Will we raise a generation that fears God more than governments? Will we become people of sincerity, justice and truth, so that we're not just watching history, we're part of shaping it? Because the Quran isn't just a book of what happened, it's a map for what can happen if we rise to the call. Let's now take a step back and really reflect.
If all of this rise, this corruption, this warning, is part of a prophecy that's unfolding before our eyes, what does that mean for us? Some people hear all this and feel overwhelmed. They say, but I'm just one person, what can I do? Others feel fear, thinking of the end times as something terrifying, and some simply shut down. They scroll past it, numb, tired, detached. But the Quran doesn't tell us these stories to scare us. It tells us to prepare us. It's not calling us to panic. It's calling us to purpose. The signs of the hour, their goal isn't to freeze us. It's to wake us, to remind us that history is not random, that events, however chaotic they seem, are part of a divine story, a plan, a process, and we are in the middle of it. So what do? We start small but real. We reconnect with the Quran, not just reading the words, but letting them read us, letting them change how we see the world, how we treat others, how we handle power and pain. We reconnect with prayer, not as a habit, but as a heartbeat, because in a world this unstable, the only true stability is in our connection with the one who never changes. We stand with the oppressed, with our voices, with our platforms, with our wealth, with our dua, with whatever we have, because silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity. And if we say we follow the Prophet, then we must live like he did, always on the side of the truth, no matter the cost. We raise our children with vision, with identity, with love for their Deen, love for justice, love for the sacred, because they might be the generation that walks into that masjid, not with arrogance, but with light. And above all, we have hope, because yes, these are heavy times. Yes, the world feels dark, but the Quran came down in darkness to bring light, and every prophecy of hardship ends with the rise of truth. So don't just watch the signs, be a sign. Let your life be a proof that in a time of confusion, clarity still exists, that in a time of corruption, character still matters, that in a time of fear, faith still lives. The story is still being written, and we're not spectators, we're part of it. So rise, in prayer, in purpose, in sincerity, because the Ummah needs hearts that carry light, not just for Palestine, not just for the sacred masjid, but for the whole world. Because when the hour comes, we all want to be standing on the right side of history, and the right side of the hereafter. We've reached the end of this journey, but the story itself isn't over. What the Quran spoke of, the first corruption, the first fall, the second rise, is still unfolding, and the second downfall, it may be just ahead. But this isn't just about history, or one nation, it's about us. The Quran is a mirror. It asks us, who are we becoming? Are we standing for justice, or staying silent? Are we connected to the sacred, or distracted by comfort? Even now, with all the oppression and pain, the door of mercy is still open. The verse says, maybe your Lord will have mercy on you, so don't give up. Keep your eyes on the Quran. Keep your heart tied to truth. Be part of the promise, not the warning, and maybe, just maybe, we'll be among those who see the sacred masjid restored, not with politics, but with sincerity. May we live with truth, may we rise with dignity, and may our hearts always beat for what is sacred. Ameen.